I am 55 years old, and for 11 years, I was the quiet gravity that kept Crestline Solutions from floating off into the cold void of corporate bankruptcy. Walter Cunningham, the founder, hired me when the company was nothing but 6 people working out of a dusty, converted warehouse in the South Industrial Park. In those early days, the roof leaked whenever it rained, and we had to cover our primary server rack with a plastic tarp to keep the water from shorting out our motherboard. We built our entire digital systems using Craigslist parts, refurbished cables, and pure grit. I did not have a flashy title back then, and I did not have one when I left. I was not a vice president of Synergy, a director of global operations, or a chief strategy officer. On my plastic security badge, it simply read Facilities Manager and Systems Administrator. But while the fancy executives spent their days chasing venture capital, drinking craft beer in glass conference rooms, and drawing useless flowcharts, I was the one who actually ran the physical and digital reality of the company. In the legal registries, federal compliance databases, and property deeds, my signature was the only one that mattered. I was the officially registered custodian of record. I was the named contact on our federal vendor profiles, our government GSA contract schedules, our IRS business filings, and the physical campus lease that covered our 3-story office building. I carried the master campus keys on a heavy brass ring. It held the physical override keys to the server rooms, the power substations, the executive suites, and the underground storage vaults. I also carried the 2 biometric security token drives, physical USB devices bound to my own thumbprint that authorized any high-level changes to our root credentials. Then Walter Cunningham decided he needed to find inner peace and went on a sabbatical to a Sedona wellness retreat. In his place, he left his 29-year-old son, Preston Cunningham, as the interim chief executive officer. Preston was a young man who did not climb the corporate ladder. He floated down onto the top floor in a parachute stitched from trust funds, expensive private schools, and unearned confidence. He drove a customized sports car, wore suits that cost more than my first home, and spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords. On his very first day, he decided he needed to establish absolute dominance over the company. He wanted a public spectacle to show that the old guard was finished and that his lean, agile era had begun. He wanted to clear what he called the dead weight of the previous decade. I was his primary target because I did not fit his image of a modern, fast-paced tech executive. At exactly 12:15 p.m., during the middle of the busy lunch rush, Preston marched into the cafeteria. He did not use a microphone, but his voice boomed across the room as he stood on top of a central lunch table. Everyone froze. He pointed his finger directly at me, shouting that Crestline Solutions was done carrying dead weight. He announced that I was a relic of a slow, paper-heavy past, a soft-skilled dinosaur who was holding back corporate progress. In front of 45 junior analysts, the entire accounting staff, and the facilities crew, he declared that I was terminated, effective immediately. He told the room that this was a warning to anyone else who thought they were irreplaceable. He then looked down at me and demanded that I hand over all company property on the spot. The silence in the cafeteria was absolute. A fork clattered against a plate, sounding like a gunshot. I did not argue, I did not beg, and I did not raise my voice. I simply stood up, reached into my canvas bag, and pulled out the heavy brass ring of master campus keys along with the 2 biometric security tokens. I walked over and slid them across the table. I looked Preston in the eye and said, "Good luck." He smirked, pocketing the keys like he had just won a war against a janitor. He had no idea what he had actually taken. He did not know that those keys and tokens were not just physical tools, but the legal and technical backbone of the company's entire infrastructure. I walked out past the reception desk, past the stunned interns, and past that motivational poster I always hated about teamwork making the dream work. I went straight to my car, sat in the dark parking garage, and opened my glove box to retrieve the blue binder. It was labeled Crestline Solutions, Facilities Protocols and Custodian Registrations. For 11 years, Walter and I had built this company from the ground up. In the early days, when a ransomware attack threatened to wipe out our entire database, I was the one who stayed awake for 48 hours straight in the server room to manually rebuild the arrays. When the municipal fire inspector threatened to shut down our campus due to illegal basement wiring, I was the one who spent 3 days negotiating a fireproof safety waiver. Walter trusted me with a level of access that did not come with a fancy title. It came with legal liability. I was the named custodian on everything from the digital system backbone to the physical lease agreements. And now, they had a young interim boss who did not know the difference between a root certificate and an access badge. I did not need to sabotage anything. I just had to step away and let gravity do the work. I turned the ignition, backed out of the garage, and drove home. To really understand how we got here, you have to understand the early days. Walter Cunningham was a visionary, but he was a practical one. He knew that writing code was only 10% of building a business. The other 90% was the boring, slow, and expensive process of keeping the lights on, the servers secure, and the government happy. When we had only 3 clients and were operating on a shoestring budget, Walter sat me down and explained that we could not afford to make mistakes with compliance. He said, "Arthur, I can build the engine, but I need you to build the chassis. I need you to be the guy who signs the papers and carries the legal burden." So, we set up a dual custody framework. It was a simple idea. The CEO would have the authority to make business decisions, but the registered custodian would have the legal custody of the systems and assets. That way, no single person could sell the company's core technology or shut down the network on a whim. It was a safety valve designed to protect the company from hostiles or accidents. But Preston did not care about safety valves. He did not even know they existed. To him, the company was a playground, a sandbox where he could play the role of a tech guru. He had spent his entire life watching profiles of billionaire founders on television, and he thought that leadership was about making loud speeches, firing people publicly, and using words like paradigm shift. He did not understand that behind every billionaire founder is a team of quiet, boring people who make sure the taxes are paid, the contracts are signed, and the server rooms are ventilated. He thought that by firing me, he was cutting away the anchor that was keeping his ship from sailing. He did not realize that the anchor was the only thing keeping the ship from crashing into the rocks. I sat in my car for a long time, watching the office building in my rearview mirror, and realized that the countdown had already begun. I drove home and kicked open my front door. The foundation of my old house had settled weirdly back in 2008, and the door always stuck a little to the left. I liked it that way because it pushed back, the way the world should when things are not aligned. I sat at my kitchen table, poured a glass of cheap wine, and opened the blue binder. I was not angry. I was simply quiet. When you build something block by block for 11 years, you learn how the pieces fit together. You also learn what happens when you remove the keystone. I did not sabotage a single file. I did not delete databases or change administrative passwords. Sabotage is messy, illegal, and loud. Instead, I practiced absolute silent compliance. I began making a few phone calls to our external vendors, keeping my voice calm and professional. My first call was to Clara at CoreVault, the secure cloud hosting provider that managed our off-site server backups and digital infrastructure. She answered on the second ring, sounding confused. She said she had just received an automatic bounce back from my corporate email address and asked if I was okay. I told her that I had been terminated and was no longer authorized to sign off on maintenance overrides, emergency restores, or security clearances. She went completely silent for a moment, then pointed out that my name was still the only primary contact on the account. I replied that it was no longer my circus and wished her well. Next, I called Roger at NextGrid, the vendor that managed our physical campus badge access systems, door locks, and surveillance logs. When I explained that I was no longer with the company, he let out a dry laugh. He said that explained the dashboard alerts he was seeing, as the systems had been trying to verify my credentials for a routine security update. He warned me that without my active validation, the badge readers would lock down within 24 hours as a built-in safety feature. I told him to contact the new management and hung up. The first real system failure occurred at exactly 7:12 a.m. the following morning. Preston Cunningham arrived at the office, feeling like the king of the world, and swiped his executive badge against the reader of the main entrance. The reader emitted a long, high-pitched error beep and flashed red. He swiped it again, then slammed it against the glass. Nothing. Harvey, the senior janitor who had worked at the campus since the early 1990s, walked past with a trash bin, shrugged, and told him the lock sometimes needed a jiggle, or he should just ask Arthur. Preston turned red and snapped that Arthur no longer worked there. Harvey nodded slowly and said that explained why the lock was not responding before walking away humming a tune. By 8:30 a.m., more than 60 employees were huddled outside the glass doors in business casual attire, looking like cold birds waiting for breadcrumbs. The morning air was chilly, and the crowd was growing restless. Preston was furious, demanding that Devin, the head of IT, bypass the security system immediately. Devin explained over the phone that it was impossible. The system used federal tamper evasion protocols, and the root access was hard-coded to my biometric token and my registered email. They could not issue new badge permissions or override the lock without triggering a major security breach alarm that would alert the local police. By noon, the financial gears began to grind to a halt. The payroll run for the biweekly cycle hit a validation loop. Gavin, the finance director, rushed into Preston's office with a stack of papers. He explained that the dual verification payroll system required a second-tier authorization token, a physical key that I held. Because that key had been disconnected without a formal off-boarding transition, the issuing bank flagged the corporate account as potentially compromised. At the same time, a critical shipment of microprocessors from our primary hardware vendor was denied at the loading dock. The vendor system showed that Crestline was listed as compliance unresolved because the primary compliance signatory, which was me, had been removed from the portal with no replacement. Preston sent a rushed email to the vendor telling them they did not need a compliance signatory anymore and that this was a new era. The vendor's automated system immediately flagged the corporate account and suspended all active shipments. To make matters worse, the banking portal for our international accounts also went into lockdown mode. Our treasury management system, which Walter and I had configured 4 years ago to prevent corporate fraud, required a physical security key verification every 14 days. This verification had to be performed by the registered custodian of record. When the automated system attempted to ping my secure server profile and found it disabled, it assumed that a corporate takeover or a security breach was underway. The system did not send an email asking for clarification. It simply froze all outgoing wire transfers over $10,000. Gavin was nearly in tears as he explained to Preston that we could not pay our offshore software developers or our marketing agency. Preston yelled at him to find a workaround, but there was no workaround. The system was doing exactly what we had designed it to do. Protect the company's funds from unauthorized access by locking down when the custodian disappeared. I poured another glass of wine and watched the panic unfold on my personal phone through the company's public Slack channel, which they had forgotten to remove me from. The hot summer air made things worse. That afternoon, one of Preston's junior IT assistants tried to log into the facility's console to force the doors open. Instead of unlocking the building, the system interpreted the unauthorized attempt as a cyber attack and triggered a localized security hold. The backup HVAC system kicked in, shutting down the ventilation and setting the thermostat in the west wing to 92 degrees. Within an hour, the junior analysts were sweating through their shirts and complaining of headaches. Preston, growing increasingly desperate, did what he always did when confronted with his own failure. He looked for a scapegoat. He fired Devin, the head of IT, for failing to resolve what he called a simple software glitch. He then appointed his old college fraternity buddy, Brad, as the new vice president of technology. Brad was a young man whose primary tech experience consisted of running a cryptocurrency blog and setting off a fire alarm at his previous job. Brad immediately tried to log into the database servers from his personal laptop, which triggered a security flag from our firewall. Within 30 minutes, the internal network went dark, and the entire company was cut off from their email servers. While Crestline was melting down, I was sitting in a cool, glass-walled conference room at Apex Vanguard, the chief competitor of Crestline Solutions. I was meeting with Diana, their chief operating officer. She was a sharp woman who did not care about corporate buzzwords. She only cared about results. She looked at my resume, closed the folder, and said she had been trying to figure out how Crestline had operated so smoothly for a decade. She told me she now realized that I was the reason. The meeting lasted only 8 minutes. I walked out with a principal consulting contract, stocks options, and a quiet office that overlooked the Crestline building. I could look out my window and see the employees standing in the parking lot, fanning themselves with paper folders. But the real crisis for Crestline was still brewing. For the past 6 months, Walter Cunningham had been negotiating a $200 million merger and infrastructure contract with Novatech, a massive technology conglomerate. The deal was supposed to be finalized by the end of the month, and it was the only thing keeping Crestline's high debt load from collapsing. Novatech's legal counsel, a meticulous lawyer named Oliver Finch, conducted a standard compliance and security audit before transferring the first block of investment funds. As he went through the registry files, he noticed that all the active cybersecurity frameworks, physical security protocols, and federal compliance certifications were tied to a single name, Arthur Vance. He also noticed that there was no record of an offboarding transition or a registered backup custodian. Oliver Finch did not call Preston Cunningham. He called me directly. He asked if I was still the custodial officer of record for Crestline Solutions. I answered him truthfully. I told him that I had been terminated publicly on a Monday afternoon, with no notice, no transition period, and no offboarding protocols. I explained that I was no longer associated with the company and could not verify the security or integrity of their digital infrastructure. I also mentioned that, according to my personal logs, there had been multiple unauthorized attempts to access the credential servers using my old logins. Oliver Finch thanked me for my candor, and I hung up. 2 days later, Novatech sent a formal letter to Crestline, stating that they were pausing all merger negotiations, pending a complete review of the company's compliance structure. The silence from Novatech was a death sentence for Crestline's expansion plans. They had already hired 15 new engineers and leased an additional floor in the adjacent building in anticipation of the merger. Without the initial $25 million cash injection that was scheduled for the end of the week, they would be unable to meet their payroll obligations by the middle of the next month. Preston tried to call Oliver Finch multiple times, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He then sent a long, rambling email to Novatech's executive board, explaining that I was merely a disgruntled former employee who was trying to sabotage the company. He claimed that Brad had the systems fully under control and that the network was more secure than ever. But corporate lawyers like Oliver Finch do not care about promises or excuses. They only care about verified logs and legal documentation. When they saw that the named custodian of the network security certificates was no longer with the company, and that there was no legal transfer of authority on file, they knew that any data transferred to Crestline's servers would be exposed to massive security and compliance risks. They had no choice but to halt the deal. Meanwhile, over at Apex Vanguard, Diana was already preparing for the fallout. She had watched Crestline's rise with concern over the past few years, but she knew that a company built on a hollow shell of public relations could not survive a major operational crisis. She told me that Apex Vanguard was ready to offer migration assistance to any of Crestline's clients who were affected by the ongoing system disruptions. She asked me to review their own compliance structures to ensure they did not have the same vulnerabilities. I spent the afternoon analyzing their system profiles, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction as I realized that Apex Vanguard actually valued the quiet, boring work of security and compliance. They did not want a boy king, they wanted a working engine. When the letter from Novatech arrived, Preston Cunningham went into a complete rage. He called a company-wide town hall in the break room, trying to spin the disaster. He stood before the remaining employees, sweating in the 92-degree heat, and claimed that the delay was just a minor legal hiccup. He mocked me publicly again, calling me the king of filing cabinets, and claiming that modern companies did not need soft-skilled dinosaurs who relied on paper rules. He said they were going to bypass the old systems and build a new, agile network. But while Preston was shouting at the interns, Gordon, the general counsel of Crestline, was not laughing. He called an emergency meeting of the board's compliance subcommittee. He laid out the legal reality, and for the first time, the board members began to look terrified. Gordon explained that Preston's actions had exposed the company to immense legal liability. First, by firing the company historian, 2 remote workers, and the facilities manager without the mandatory 60-day notice, Preston had violated the Federal Warning Act under 29 U.S.C. Section 2101, which applies to companies with over 100 employees undergoing sudden layoffs. This opened Crestline up to class action lawsuits for back pay and benefits. More importantly, Gordon explained the concept of fiduciary duty. As interim CEO, Preston owed a duty of care to the corporation. By firing the registered custodian of record with zero transition planning, he had effectively shut down the operational capability of the company, resulting in the suspension of a $200,000 contract. This was a clear breach of fiduciary duty that could make Preston and the board personally liable to the shareholders. But the worst was yet to come. In a desperate attempt to resolve the lockout, Preston and his HR director had retroactively altered the company's compliance filings. They had uploaded documents to the federal portal, claiming that I had voluntarily resigned and that the credentials had been legally transferred to Brad. They had even forged my electronic signature on the transfer logs to speed up the process. The federal security portal's automated fraud detection system had flagged the submission immediately due to the mismatch in IP addresses and the sudden change in authorization dates. Gordon looked at the board members and told them that this was a violation of California Penal Code, Section 470, which covers forgery. Under the law, because the signature was forged, the entire transfer was void ab initio, meaning it was completely invalid from the very beginning. The federal government had placed Crestline on a provisional verification hold, freezing their ability to bid on any public contracts and initiating a formal compliance audit. The board members sat in silence, realizing that the Boy King had not just fired an employee. He had turned their entire corporate structure into a legal crime scene. Gordon pointed out that if the federal audit went public, it would trigger a cascade of vendor defaults. Under our commercial agreements, any regulatory investigation or hold on federal compliance portals had to be disclosed to our banking partners within 5 business days. If we failed to disclose it, or if they found out through their own audits, they had the right to call in our outstanding loans immediately. Crestline had a 12,000 line of credit that we used to fund our daily operations. If the bank called in that loan, the company would be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy before the end of the month. One of the board members asked Preston if he had consulted legal before uploading the files. Preston stammered, claiming that Brad had told him it was just a standard technical override and that everyone did it. Gordon sighed, rubbed his temples, and said, "Preston, a technical override is when you reset a router. Forging a federal compliance signature is a felony." The board members looked at each other, and the realization of their ruin began to sink in. To make matters worse, several senior developers who had been forced to work in the sweltering heat had already contacted the local Department of Labor to complain about unsafe working conditions. They were threatening to file a complaint with the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, which would trigger yet another audit. The company was facing a multi-front legal war, and they did not have a single compliance officer left to manage the paperwork. Preston sat in the corner of the boardroom, his face pale, his hand shaking as he realized that his corporate career was effectively over before it had even begun. The final board meeting was not listed on any corporate calendar. Walter Cunningham, the founder, had returned from Sedona being the place where he had spent 3 weeks trying to find inner peace, only to find his life's work on the verge of bankruptcy. He sat at the head of the long table, his face pale and lined with exhaustion. Preston sat near the corner, his expensive suit looking crumpled, his combative attitude completely gone. Gordon, the general counsel, did not offer any comfort. He began the meeting by presenting a document that Preston had never even bothered to read. The original 15-year lease agreement for the Crestline campus. The lease contained a specific transition clause. It stated that in the event of a leadership vacancy or a sudden disruption in corporate governance, the legal control of the physical premises would temporarily devolve to the registered custodian of record, which was me, until a formal notarized reassignment was filed with the property owner. Because I had been fired without a legal offboarding process and no replacement had been validated, I was still the only person who had the legal authority to sign lease renewals or approve facility modifications. Legally, Crestline was occupying the building without a valid representative, putting them in immediate breach of their commercial lease. The next morning, Novatech sent their final decision. They officially withdrew from all merger discussions, citing a failure to meet compliance standards and unresolved security risks. The loss of the $200 million deal was the final blow. Crestline's stock value plummeted, and the board voted unanimously to strip Preston of all authority and terminate his contract for cause, preventing him from collecting any severance. As for me, I did not watch the collapse from afar. I opened my own firm, Vance Advisory Group, in a small suite on the 5th floor of the building directly across the street. The office was quiet and clean, and my desk faced the window, giving me a perfect view of the Crestline entrance. My new venture was funded by two of Crestline's former clients who had grown tired of Preston's chaotic management and wanted a partner who understood both the technology and the rules. Within a week, we were already profitable, taking over the compliance accounts of businesses that valued stability over buzzwords at 9:42 p.m. On my second week, I walked across the street one last time. I did not sneak in and I did not gloat. I walked past the reception desk, where Sarah, the HR specialist, looked up with wide eyes. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old brass key ring containing the physical keys to the boiler rooms and server racks, along with the now deactivated security tokens. I dropped them into the metal tray on the counter and told her that I was returning some trash. I turned on my heel and walked back to my new office. I did not look back. I did not need to destroy Crestline myself. I had simply taken the keys, stepped aside, and allowed their own arrogance to pull the building down. They finally understood that you can run a company on hype for a little while. But in the end, it is the quiet foundation that keeps the roof from falling. As I sat at my new desk, looking out the window at the dark windows of Crestline Solutions, I felt a deep sense of peace. For 11 years, I had carried the weight of that company on my shoulders, worrying about the servers, the compliance, the leases, and the taxes. I had worked late nights, missed family dinners, and sacrificed my own health to make sure that Walter's dream succeeded. And in the end, it had all been wiped out in a matter of minutes by a young man who thought that my work was invisible. But as the old saying goes, you do not value the air until you cannot breathe. Preston and the board had to learn that the hard way. They had tried to build a digital castle on a foundation of sand, and now the tide had come in. Vance Advisory Group was growing quickly, and we had already signed 3 new contracts with clients who had fled Crestline during the chaos. We did not promise them agile revolution or vision. We promised them security, compliance, and reliability. The boring stuff. The stuff that actually works. Walter Cunningham called me a few days later. He did not sound like a proud founder anymore. He sounded like a tired old friend. He asked if we could meet for a cup of coffee to discuss a potential transition plan for Crestline's remaining assets. I told him that I would be happy to meet with him, but that my consulting fees were now 3 times what my old salary had been. He did not argue. He simply sighed and agreed. I knew that he understood. It was not about revenge or greed. It was about respect. Respect for the work, the details, and the rules. As I hung up the phone, I looked across the street and saw the lights in Crestline's building flick off, one by one. The boy king was gone, and the quiet ones were finally in charge.